October the 2nd, 1943, Pacific Ocean, 220 miles south of Truk Lagoon. The water was too still that morning. Lieutenant Commander Isamu Tanaka stood on the deck of the Kaihō Maru, his gaze fixed on the sea, which mirrored the pale gray of the sky like a glass sheet stretched endlessly into the unknown. There was no wind, no birds, no distant ship smoke. Only silence. The kind of silence that unnerved even seasoned men of the sea. The Pacific had long been a fortress for the empire. Its waves carried the pride of Japan's Imperial Navy across thousands of miles. From Pearl Harbor to the coastlines of Java and the Philippines, the ocean had bent to their will, or so they believed. That morning, everything began to change. They had been cruising in formation, 3 destroyers, 2 light cruisers, and the Kaihō Maru, a modified cargo vessel fitted with new sonar equipment, an experimental model only a handful of officers were trained to use. Tanaka was one of them. His orders were simple. Test the range and accuracy of the device during transit. Report anomalies, nothing more. But it was what the sonar picked up at precisely 0913 hours that made Tanaka grip the edge of the console. An echo. Not a whale, not a ship, not static. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and it was moving. He called the officer on duty. "Run it again," Tanaka said quietly. "Filter out engine interference." The technician obeyed. They watched as the waveform emerged on the screen. A deep, pulsing tone that rose and fell with almost human precision. It was too far down to be a submarine, and too smooth to be machinery. The nearest American forces were thousands of miles away, and yet the signal was approaching them, fast. Tanaka's first instinct was to believe it was a malfunction. The system was still unproven, but then the escort ship Yamakaze reported the same signal. 5 minutes later, the Chokai reported sonar contact without visuals. Depth estimates placed the object at 1,200 meters, deep but rising. Within 20 minutes, the entire convoy was on high alert, and then, just as suddenly as it had come, the echo vanished. Gone. No trace, no signal, no wake, no enemy. The sea returned to silence. The Kaihō Maru kept sailing, but its crew grew restless. Tanaka, too, felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing on his chest. Not fear, but foreboding. He scribbled in his logbook. Strange echo detected, unidentified. Signal had shape. Intelligence must be consulted, but they never made it to intelligence. 2 days later, as the fleet approached the outlying coral atolls near Eniwetok, something happened that would change the course of the war, though few would live to tell it. In the dark of the early morning, before the sun had breached the horizon, the Kaihō Maru shook, not from within, but from the water itself. A muffled thud echoed through the hull, then another. The ship lurched leftward as if nudged by an invisible hand. "Impact on starboard," someone shouted, but when they looked there was nothing. Then, silence again, except for the sonar. It came alive once more, this time screaming with feedback. The console hissed and popped, nearly catching fire from overload. A reading spiked on the display. Something massive, moving beneath them. Bigger than any vessel Tanaka had ever heard of. And it was rising again. Before orders could be issued, the Yamakaze, 500 meters to the east, exploded. Not from an air raid, not from shelling. From beneath. A torpedo strike. Mines? The water erupted into flame and steam. Panic overtook the remaining vessels. Alarms blared. Men shouted across radios and screamed into headsets, trying to make sense of what could strike with such force and vanish without trace. In his final radio message before transmission was cut off, Commander Tanaka spoke just 8 words. "The ocean is no longer under our command." That was the last anyone heard from the Kaihō Maru. No debris was recovered, no survivors were found. For decades, the Imperial Navy would call it an equipment failure. But whispers passed among the few who knew what really happened. Whispers of a force that had claimed the sea for itself. Whispers of something. Listening. Waiting. And when it heard the echo of man again, it responded, with silence, and then with death. The Kaihō Maru was listed as lost at sea in the official war records, buried under generic terms like likely enemy action or natural maritime hazard. But deep within the folds of the Navy's intelligence archives, stamped top secret and stored where only a handful of men were allowed to read, were the sonar logs and final radio records from that doomed convoy, the waveform, the spike, the silence that followed. They were never shared with the Emperor. They were never meant to be seen by anyone again. Until 3 months later. January 1944, Navy Fortress, Kure Naval Base, Hiroshima Prefecture. Captain Osamu Hirano was not a man easily shaken. Decorated for his service during the Shanghai incident and again for his role at Midway, he was respected and feared by those under his command. But when he was called to a midnight briefing in a sealed bunker below Kure, what he saw made his hand tremble against the table. Laid before him were the recovered acoustic charts from the Kaihō Maru. Beside them, newly decoded Allied radio intercepts. One from a U.S. submarine patrol off the Marshall Islands, another from an Australian reconnaissance plane. Different dates, different zones, but the same chilling description. Echo anomaly detected. Subsurface object moved at impossible speed. Broke sonar tracking. Evaded visual confirmation. Assumed non-natural origin. Non-natural. That's what chilled Hirano the most. Even the Americans, with all their might, didn't know what they had encountered, and they had only survived because their patrol turned back, unlike Tanaka's fleet. Hirano leaned over the maps of the Pacific. A pattern began to emerge. A region, vast but focused, where ships had gone missing. Silent sectors, faded radio beacons, unreturned scout planes. Some losses were blamed on enemy attack, others on storms. But now he began to see it wasn't random. It was as if something beneath the sea was watching, waiting, measuring the rhythm of human expansion, and pushing back when it felt the pressure grow too much. A week later, Hirano was aboard the Shinkai Maru, a deep-sea research cruiser previously used by marine biologists, now repurposed by the Navy. His orders were classified. His mission simple: chart the anomaly zone. Record any signals. Do not engage. They didn't make it 12 hours before they heard it. The echo. Low, slow, distant, at first, like a heartbeat buried under a mile of water. The same rhythmic pulse from the Kaihō Maru logs. The sonar techs began to panic. One, a 22-year-old boy fresh from training, fainted when the waveform matched, exactly, the one from Tanaka's last recording. Hirano stood over the sonar operator. Estimate distance. The technician's voice trembled. It's not coming toward us, sir. We're moving toward it. He didn't understand. Explain. The technician adjusted the dials, recalibrated twice, then swallowed hard. It's stationary. Huge. At least 3 kilometers wide, sitting on the seafloor, and we've been sailing straight toward it for the last hour. Hirano stared at the dark, pulsing waves on the screen. A mountain-sized mass lying deep and still, yet somehow alive in the way it affected the water around it. Then the signal changed. The pulse became faster, almost like it had noticed them. The air in the control room seemed to thin. Men grew quiet, instinctively lowering their voices. Some made quiet prayers. Others refused to look at the screen at all. That's when the static began. Not just on the sonar, but the radios, the intercoms. Even the electric lights began to flicker. One of the senior officers shouted that the compasses had stopped working. Another reported depth pressure spiking, even though they hadn't descended. And then came the sound. Not through the speakers, through the hull, a grinding, groaning moan that vibrated like a giant steel cable snapping beneath the ocean. Every man on the ship felt it in his bones. Some screamed, others dropped to their knees. One man, a torpedo specialist, began muttering that it was a god, that they had awakened something ancient. Hirano wanted to disbelieve, wanted to find the rational explanation, a trenchquake, an underwater landslide. But nothing fit. No force of nature echoed like that. No movement of rock disabled every instrument on a warship. Then, just like before, the signal vanished, and the water around them began to bubble. The ocean didn't boil like water over fire. No, it churned from beneath. Gentle at first, as if something massive had exhaled. The surface rippled in long, slow rings around the Kaihō Maru, stretching far into the horizon in every direction. Captain Hirano stood frozen on the bridge, staring at the waves. "Engines, full reverse," he barked, but the order came too late. A tremor hit the ship, not from above, but from under the keel, like a rising swell that didn't crest. The ship heaved upward, steel groaned. Men grabbed railings and braced. Then the swell dropped, fast, violently, as though the ship had fallen into an unseen pit in the sea. They were being pulled downward, not by gravity, but by pressure. "Something's opened beneath us," the navigator shouted. Below deck, the engine room crew reported rising water pressure and failing coolant systems. The sonar, now completely useless, emitted nothing but high-pitched screeches, not from interference but from overload. It was sensing too much. As if every layer of the ocean beneath them had become alive. And then came the shape. At first it was a shadow, a mass below them, no more than a darker patch of blue, but it expanded rapidly, eclipsing the ship's underside. Crewmen watched from the starboard side as the water shifted colors, a deep, ink-black void spreading outward like a stain. It wasn't just large, it was impossibly large. Some swore they saw a gleam, like metal. Others insisted it was scales. One man, a scientist who'd studied cephalopods, whispered that the pattern on the surface below them looked too symmetrical to be natural. Then came the light, a soft pulse, greenish-white, emanating from deep below, rhythmically flashing every few seconds. It wasn't a beacon, it was an eye. One of the sailors fell to the deck and screamed, "It sees us! It's watching us!" Panic spread like fire on oil. The helmsman turned the wheel frantically, but the ship didn't move. The water wouldn't let them. Propellers whined uselessly as if pushing against a vacuum. Something beneath was holding them still. And then came the sound again. This time, it was inside the ship. No speakers, no radios. It vibrated through the steel, through the floor, through their very bones. A low, resonant hum that seemed to reach into their skulls. Men began bleeding from their noses. A young ensign collapsed, frothing at the mouth. Captain Hirano knew what this was. Not literally, but instinctively. A warning. This thing wasn't attacking them yet. It was communicating, demonstrating, letting them feel just how insignificant they were in its presence, like a man watching ants scurry across a boot. Hirano reached for the emergency flare controls. He would not die quietly. If it took the entire fuel reserve, he would light the sky and let someone, anyone, see what had happened here. But before he could act, the pressure dropped. Suddenly, the Kaihō Maru jolted upward like a cork let loose underwater. Alarms blared, engines surged. Whatever had held them was gone. The water beneath began to still. The ship rocked violently, but they were afloat again. Then came the silence. Not peaceful, not calm, but intentional, as if something had disappeared, or simply withdrawn. The sonar returned to normal. The compasses realigned. The lights stopped flickering. And just like that, the thing that had held them vanished into the depths, leaving no sign it had ever been there. Except for the lingering trauma in every man's eyes, and the shredded recordings of sonar that now bore signals no human could understand. Captain Hirano didn't wait. "Set course north," he ordered, voice hoarse. "Maximum speed. We report this to High Command directly, and no one speaks a word until we reach Japan." That night, as they retreated from the shadowed zone of the anomaly, the crew remained silent. No laughter, no stories, no singing, only the hum of the engines, and the knowledge that the ocean was not theirs anymore, and perhaps never had been. The Shinkai Maru reached Yokosuka Naval Base 6 days later, battered, silent, and not a single man aboard the same as when they'd left. The official report was brief and sanitized. Extreme undersea pressure event, minor damage, all systems restored, no enemy contact. But what Captain Osamu Hirano submitted privately, handwritten, sealed, and delivered directly to the Navy High Command, was something else entirely. Inside were detailed sonar readings, diagrams of the formation seen beneath the ship, and a personal note scrawled at the end. "We are not alone in the deep, and we are not welcome." High Command did what militaries often do in times of inconvenient truth. They buried it, locked the files away in the ministry's underground vaults, redacted names, and transferred every man from the Shinkai Maru to separate divisions across the mainland. Isolation ensured silence, and silence, they believed, would ensure control. But word still leaked, not to the press, not to the Americans, but to those few men in the Imperial Navy who'd already begun to whisper about the Ghost Fleet. Stories of entire convoys disappearing without distress calls, sonar shadows that weren't submarines, ships returning without their crews, food uneaten, rifles still loaded, the decks wet but the sea calm. Then came mid-February, the turning point. A new naval experiment was underway, Project Tetsujin no Mimi. The Iron Ear, Japan's attempt to build a long-range sonar network across several Pacific islands. It was designed to detect enemy vessels long before they reached the homeland. Dozens of high-frequency arrays buried in the sea linked through cables and generators across the islands. For 5 days, the system worked. The readings were precise. Ships as far as 300 kilometers away were tracked with stunning accuracy. Commanders believed they finally had the tool to secure the Pacific. Then, on the 6th day, the entire system went blind. Every sensor, simultaneously, transmitted a single, uniform signal. Not a malfunction, not interference. It was the echo. The same echo from the Kaihō Maru, the same pulse that nearly tore the Shinkai Maru apart. And this time, it had changed. It no longer rose and fell gently. It surged, like a war drum pounding from the deep. Violent, direct, unmistakably deliberate. Engineers tried to reset the system, but each reset triggered another pulse. Louder, faster. Then the transmission ceased, completely, and the sea followed. 3 hours later, the island of Eniwetak, where the primary sonar array was based, reported massive undersea tremors, a low-frequency quake that no seismologist could explain. The water around the island receded suddenly, as if being sucked into a hole. Then returned violently, not a full tsunami but a sudden wave that battered the coastline and shattered equipment. 2 naval engineers were swept into the sea. Neither was recovered. That night, the American listening posts in the Pacific picked up the same echo. Their analysts, unable to identify its origin, codenamed it Deep Blue Phantom. They believed it was a Japanese secret weapon, a new form of undersea warfare. They were wrong. Back in Tokyo, Captain Hirano was called into a meeting with the most powerful men in the empire, admirals, ministers, scientists from the Marine Observation Bureau. For 4 hours, they grilled him. What did you see? Was it a creature? Was it a weapon? Was it Soviet? Hirano said nothing at first. Then, with a calm voice that chilled every man in the room, he answered, "You are asking the wrong question, It is not what it is what we are. To it. They scoffed, demanded clarity. Hirano leaned forward and said, "To that thing, to that presence. We are ants with rifles, loud, arrogant, temporary." There was silence. Then one of the admirals asked him what should be done. "Nothing," Hirano replied. "We retreat from its waters. We erase our sonar networks. We stop probing the deep." They called him a coward, a disgrace. They stripped his rank the next day. But when Hirano returned home, a quiet man with no uniform and no medals, he kept one thing, the sonar print from the Kaihō Maru, folded in his pocket. And every night he listened to the ocean from his shoreside home, because deep down he knew, whatever it was, it hadn't finished rising. It had simply warned them. And the next time the Japanese Navy, or any Navy, dared to listen too closely, they would not be given a second chance. 2 months passed. By April 1944, the Pacific War was intensifying. The Americans were advancing relentlessly across island chains, their carriers growing bolder, their submarines more daring. Japan was losing ground, not only to the enemy, but to the sea itself, because it wasn't just the Japanese who had begun to whisper. In Pearl Harbor, sonar operators aboard the USS Cayuga reported non-vessel movement at 2,300 meters depth, something that moved under them at 150 knots, a speed no sub could match. Days later, a British destroyer in the Indian Ocean recorded similar anomalies, sudden loss of depth readings, bizarre echo patterns, and an unshakable feeling among the crew that they were being followed. But none of those accounts were made public. No one wanted to admit that the ocean, once a field of war, had begun fighting back. The turning point came on April 12, 1944, when Japan launched Operation Koryu, a desperate effort to regain control over their eastern naval routes. 6 warships, 3 support vessels, and a sonar mapping crew set out to re-establish communication cables along a deep trench south of Iwo Jima. At the head of the expedition was Rear Admiral Hayato Kurita, a man who believed in steel, firepower, and the glory of the empire. He had read the suppressed reports of Hirano. He had laughed. "Ghost stories," he said, "told by men who stare too long at the water." The fleet sailed under bright skies. It was the last time they saw sunlight. By the evening of the second day, strange things began to happen. Their long-range radios died, not all at once, but gradually, as if being peeled away. Each channel dissolved into a thick, distorted crackle. Electric pulses that sounded less like static and more like breathing. Deep, wet, rhythmic. The helmsman aboard the cruiser Shiranui reported subtle steering resistance. Not from weather, the sea was calm, but from the water itself. It was as if something beneath was shifting the currents with unseen hands. Then, late that night, the sea lit up, not from lightning, from below. Pale green tendrils of light bloomed beneath the surface, spiraling slowly upward like jellyfish veins, but impossibly vast, hundreds of meters long. The lights pulsed softly, as if reaching for the hulls above. Sailors stared over the rails in breathless silence. One man screamed and jumped overboard, not out of terror but as if drawn, like a moth to flame. He was never seen again. The Shiranui's captain tried to sound general alarm. The moment his hand touched the intercom switch, the ship lurched. A sudden jolt, like running aground, except they were in 12,000 feet of open ocean. A moment later, the ship behind them, the Kaihō Maru, simply vanished. No explosion, no fire. Just there one moment, then gone. Where it had floated now churned a perfect whirlpool. Circular, cold, silent. No wake, no screams. Only the echo of twisted metal groaning below. Panic exploded through the fleet. Searchlights raked the sea. Depth charges were fired blindly into the blackness. Sonar pinged and failed, again and again. but there was nothing to see, only the echo. This time, it was no longer rhythmic or distant. It was invasive, a violent wave of sound that erupted from beneath and slammed into every hull at once, cracking glass, warping steel, bursting men's eardrums. Some ships lost power completely, lights dying as if smothered by a giant hand. Admiral Kurita screamed over the radio, "Surface contact, underneath all vessels. Fire, fire at will." Shells dropped. Explosions lit the sky. Water geysers rose and fell. And still nothing returned fire, because what was below them wasn't fighting. It was watching, testing, and when it had seen enough, it moved. The final message from the Shiranui came through half-scrambled and stuttering. "Shape beneath, not metal. It's alive, moon-sized, opening. It's opening." Then static and silence. The fleet was never found again. Back on the mainland, a junior intelligence officer named Yukio Abe received the last half-hour of sonar logs from the expedition, salvaged through a separate monitoring channel near the Bonin Islands. He played the recording. At first, nothing, just the usual echo pulses. Then a hum, low, but rising. Then a shape, described by the system as acoustic void, elliptical, depth indeterminate. It blocked out the entire sonar grid. Then the pulse again. A new one, deep, flat, and final. Abe took the tape to his superior. The next day, he was reassigned to Rice Logistics. The tape was destroyed. But Abe never forgot the last thing the sonar said before the blackout. Translated loosely from acoustic data, it wasn't just a pulse. It was a signal, a message. And in the language of pressure, rhythm, and deep-water resonance, it said only this: "You were warned." The weeks that followed the disappearance of Admiral Kurita's fleet were the quietest the Pacific had ever been. Not in the war. That roared on. But beneath the waves, silence. A suffocating, deliberate silence. No anomalies, no sonar ghosts, no deep pulses, not a flicker of light from below. It was as if the ocean had closed its eyes. Or worse, turned its gaze elsewhere. The Imperial Navy took the silence as victory. They thought the thing, or whatever force lived down there, had left, or died, or never existed at all. But Captain Osamu Hirano, now stripped of title and posted to a civilian advisory role in Tokyo Bay, knew better. He didn't sleep much. He spent most nights with a shortwave receiver, listening to the underwater microphones the Americans had abandoned outside Okinawa. The equipment was rusty, the wires exposed, but it still picked up faint sounds, tiny fractures in the stillness, clicks, groans. Sometimes he heard whale song, other times, things that didn't belong to whales. Then, on a fog-choked morning in late May 1944, he heard it again. The echo, not as loud, not pulsing with fury, but near, very near. He checked and rechecked the equipment, rewired cables, adjusted gain. And what he heard next made his blood freeze. A new signal, different than before. Not rhythmic like before. It was erratic, glitching, broken. Like something trying to speak with a voice it didn't know how to use. Like an imitation of human sonar. As if something was learning. That same morning, a Japanese freighter, Kaihō Maru, ran aground off the southern coast of Kyushu. The captain radioed in saying all instruments had failed. The water had gone black. And when the fog lifted, they were sitting in just 6 feet of water, 15 kilometers from shore. No injuries, no crew missing. But every one of them reported the same dream that night. A glowing eye in the deep, watching. Closer now. By June, even the Americans were uneasy. The USS Albacore, a submarine operating off the Marianas, went silent mid-patrol. Its last sonar ping showed a contact 5 times larger than an Iowa-class battleship, stationary at the bottom of a trench. They fired no torpedoes. They simply turned and never turned back. The American Navy classified it loss by unknown oceanographic event. But internally, they began building an archive. One Japan had already started and buried. They called it Project Sea Deep. In Tokyo, Hirano heard rumors. American scientists were digging up old Imperial sonar readings. Even the Germans had sent inquiries. The Kriegsmarine wanted details. They'd seen something, too, in the Baltic during a U-boat dive. Different ocean, same fear. But then, everything changed, because the Echo, the real one, returned. This time, not to a military ship, not to a research vessel, but to the civilians. July 3, 1944, a fishing village outside Iwo Jima. 7 boats vanished overnight, not wrecked, not sunk, just gone. A survivor, a boy of 12, was found drifting in a barrel 2 days later, sunburned, half mad. He kept saying the same thing. The water opened. The water opened. When they asked him what he saw, he shook and whispered, "Something breathed beneath us." And we went in. That same week, underwater cables stretching from Taiwan to the Japanese home islands went dead. Not cut. Pulled, straight down, out of the ocean floor like weeds torn from soil. The Navy sent divers. Only one returned. He surfaced, screaming, blood leaking from his ears. Blind. He said there was something sleeping in the trench, something not stone, something not natural. "It watches when you go too deep," he said over and over. "It knows the shape of our ships now. It knows our noise. It is learning us." Back in Tokyo, Hirano was summoned, not by the Navy but by the Emperor's private advisors. A civilian. Disgraced. Yet the only man who had seen it and lived. They asked him one question. If it comes to the surface, can it be stopped? Hirano didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, watching the gray waves beyond the port. Then he said, "No." A long pause. "But," he added, "perhaps it can be convinced." The room fell still. "Convinced of what?" one aide finally asked. Hirano turned, his eyes dark. "That we're not worth the trouble." August 1944. The Pacific sky hung low with heat, smoke, and the scent of war. American forces were closing in on the Marianas. Japan's hold over the sea was slipping. Carrier fleets burned. Submarines prowled like wolves. But amidst the thunder of bombs and the crash of steel, something more ancient was stirring, deeper than war, older than man. It had been weeks since the last confirmed encounter with it, the thing beneath the waves. Yet whispers kept floating in, drifting between fishing villages, naval listening posts, and ruined harbor towns. The sea has gone quiet again. But it wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of watching. And then, on the night of August the 21st, the sea spoke. It began with a vibration. At first, barely felt, just a tremble beneath the floorboards of a naval communications station in Okinawa. A glass of water shook. A pen rolled off a desk. Then came the lights. Far out on the horizon, deep green flares rose from the ocean. No source, no fire, no plane overhead. They floated upward like jellyfish, then spiraled and vanished. The communications officer stepped out into the dark, staring at the sea. The vibration grew. It wasn't an earthquake. It was rhythmic. Not shaking, pulsing. Every 10 seconds the ground throbbed like a distant heartbeat echoing through miles of water and stone. Then the instruments went haywire. Radios screeched. Power flickered. The base's emergency sirens triggered without warning, and without human input. From the western watchtower, one man screamed into the night, "The trench is bleeding." Down below, a technician checked the sonar feed, a live cable stretching into the Okinawan abyss. What he saw froze his blood. Depth reading, error, undefined signal strength, override, not human. Then the echo returned, but this time it spoke, not in words, not in sound. It poured through the systems like a virus, reshaping the very format of the sonar. The screen flashed symbols, circles, arcs, radiating patterns like crop circles made of data. Then the final shape filled the display, a vast, jagged spiral, glowing red, spreading from the center like a wound in the sea. Then everything shut down. Blackness, except for the sea. It kept pulsing. That same night, 400 miles north, Captain Hirano awoke from a nightmare. He hadn't slept deeply in months, but this was different. In his dream, he stood on the deck of a burning ship, surrounded by water stretching endlessly in every direction, and below him, something waited, not moving, not hunting, just waiting. He rushed to his receiver, the last working underwater microphone he'd hidden from decommission. Static. Then, the echo. Again. But softer now, slower, like it was reaching out, not with anger, but understanding. Something had changed. He adjusted the frequency. The pulses sharpened. He translated the rhythm by hand, matching it against wave patterns, earthquake records, even Morse code. It didn't say much, it didn't need to. But the message was clear. You burn your world. We keep the deep. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning, a boundary. The surface was mankind's playground, their battlefield, their grave. But below was not theirs to touch. Not anymore. The next day, in a hidden war room in Tokyo, Hirano met again with the Emperor's advisors. This time, they listened. Not because they believed, but because they had no other explanation. He laid it out plainly. We do not own the sea, never have. We only borrow its silence. An old admiral scoffed. You speak of it as if it were a god. Hirano shook his head. Not a god, just something that doesn't need us to exist, but that we might need to leave alone to survive. The table fell silent. Then came word from the American side. Intercepted transmissions confirmed an entire U.S. submarine flotilla had gone missing in the same trench the Japanese once mapped. Even the enemy was seeing the truth. And now, both sides were terrified. That night, every Japanese naval transmission across the Pacific was suddenly overridden, hijacked. It wasn't from the Allies. It was a signal, repeating every 3 minutes on every frequency. Not in Japanese, not in English. Just a tone, and beneath it, layered in barely audible depth, the echo, the final shape, the spiral. But this time, the spiral turned, and when it turned, the message became clear. It wasn't just watching anymore, it was rising. The morning of September 1st, 1944, began with a sky too still to be trusted. No birds, no wind. Even the waves, usually restless around Japan's southern coasts, seemed to have frozen. Waiting, breath held. At 07:12, an American reconnaissance plane, flying off the coast of Saipan, went silent. Not shot down, not jammed, just vanished. No wreckage, no distress call. One moment it was on radar. The next, it was nowhere. By 08:00, 3 other planes reported the compass failure. They circled back and swore the ocean below had changed color. Not red, not black, not blood, but green, a deep, glowing emerald, like something radioactive blooming from the sea floor. Then came the spiral. At 09:44, the USS Concord, a cruiser escorting a supply convoy toward the Philippines, picked up a visual contact off the starboard bow. At first, the crew believed it to be a capsized vessel, some unfortunate freighter, belly up and drifting. But as they drew closer, the object shifted. It wasn't metal. It wasn't man-made. It was moving, not swimming, unfolding, like the unfurling of some ancient massive petal, or worse, an eye, breaching the surface for the first time in eons. The green glow pulsed from within, rhythmic and alive, spiraling in slow, deliberate waves outward from the core. As it turned, it revealed markings, not symbols, but patterns, older than language, etched in what looked like flesh fused with stone. The ocean boiled around it, and from the center of the spiral, a column of water exploded into the sky, not from impact, but from pressure, released like a great exhale from the planet's lungs. Men aboard the Concord screamed, not from fear, but from pain. Their ears bled, their teeth vibrated in their skulls. Metal twisted, not from damage, but resonance. As if the spiral didn't just rise from the sea, it sang, a sound too low for ears, too deep for instruments. But every cell in every body heard it, a song of sovereignty, not conquest, not revenge, dominance. Back in Tokyo, Captain Hirano stood before a live broadcast of the American fleet's emergency channel. No one should have been able to hear it, but every Japanese radio began transmitting the same thing. This is USS Concord, coordinates 13 degrees north, 146 east. Something has emerged. God in the water. We did not make this. We do not belong here. Tell the world the sea is not ours. Then static, then a pulse so loud it shut down every radio on the mainland. By midday, the spiral had submerged. It didn't attack. It didn't pursue. It simply rose and then returned to the deep. But it left the sea behind it. Changed. Hundreds of Japanese and American ships reported engine failures. Compasses spun. Sonar bounced back nonsense. Depth charges dropped into trenches and never exploded, as if they'd been swallowed by velvet. And in the weeks that followed, the ocean grew colder, not in temperature, in presence. It no longer welcomed ships. Every vessel that crossed certain coordinates encountered strange phenomena: sudden fog, ice forming in tropical heat, birds falling dead from the sky. Whales beached themselves in groups as if trying to escape something beneath. Fishing communities near Iwo Jima reported the sea had gone blind. No fish, no crabs, no kelp, just silence. Just waiting. On September 17th, the final report was delivered to both Imperial and Allied high commands, though it was never officially acknowledged. It read, an entity, or force, of unknown origin exists in the Pacific trench zones. It is sentient, it is ancient, and it is territorial. It does not tolerate human interference below a certain depth. Further deep-sea incursions will be interpreted as war. Recommendation: abandon sonar grids. Avoid trench zones. Respect the spiral. Neither side responded, but both silently complied. Sonar arrays were decommissioned. Submarine patrols reduced. Maps quietly redrawn to include a new label, not official, but understood by every sailor. Dead water zone, do not enter. And Captain Hirano. He returned to his small house by the bay. Every morning he sat on the rocks, watching the sea. Not in fear, but in awe. Because now, everyone finally knew what he had known all along. The ocean was never ours. We never conquered it. We just trespassed. And the spiral let us go. Once.